From July 1917 to the end of the war, Nash would obsessively depict the landscapes of battle and their detritus. Churned up trenches, shattered artillery, broken down vehicles. The Menin Road, a scarred and pitted world. Rubble and wire, dead trees, stagnant pools of oily water, furtive soldiers scurrying, nowhere to hide. The painter's style has suddenly changed. The forms are more isolated. The fairy tale mood of his earlier work has been bombed out of him. It's oil on canvas, not pen on paper, and it's monumental, 6 feet across, the scale of history painting. It was an official commission, and the Ministry of Information encouraged Nash to look to a famous Renaissance battle painting by Paolo Uccello. But comparison shows just how subversive the Menin Road is. Uccello shows war as heroic chivalry, men jousting. Nash shows us what war looks like when chivalry's been gassed and mortared. Turns Uccello's lances into fractured tree stumps, Uccello's noble corpses into tumbled breeze blocks and scraps of metal. In modern war, you can't even find the bodies. And as for Uccello's pastoral battlescape, it's become a wasteland, a place of terror, where even the sky looks torn or incinerated. To what extent did Nash exaggerate what he saw? Flanders today is nothing like the war zone he painted, though the battlefields beneath can still be sensed. Dominic Dainduven is a historian of First World War Ypres, who's done much research on the places Nash painted.
Dominic, where exactly are we?
Well, this place was then called Sanctuary Woods. In Flemish, it's called Drieblotenbos, which is actually on the former front line of the First World War.
And did Paul Nash actually come here? Would he have once stood on this spot?
Oh, this is where he was in late 1917. But by then, the landscape was, of course, completely different of what you see today. I mean, the relief is more or less the same, but you have to take away all the trees. What you would have seen then are just stumps of trees, and the stumps would be the only thing reminding him of this being a human landscape, an earthly landscape. And it resembled more like the moon than like Earth. And the dominating color would have been brown and black throughout the whole landscape as far as you could see.
We're actually entering the space of a crater.
Yes, indeed. This is a crater which would already have been here when Nash was here, because this is a crater from 1915, 1916. But the relief, the contours in this landscape are man-made or made by the war. When my great-grandparents came back after the war, and they went to the village they once lived in, they could not even find the place where once their house had stood, which means that there were not even ruins. It was just rubble as far as the eye could see. So it's an utter wasteland. It was like entering a gate to another world.
Nash depicted the war as if he were looking into the mouth of hell or Hades. But there was no river Styx here, just flooded bomb craters. Beneath their waters, an unseen world of the dead, mutilated in their multitudes.
Time has softened the craters of the Great War. Grass has grown up on their slopes. This one's filled up with water. It looks almost picturesque. It could nearly be Monet's pond. But it wasn't like that when Paul Nash came here in 1917. This was a great black, dark hole, a huge wound, exploded into the flesh of the landscape. Now, these craters weren't caused by aerial bombardment. They were caused by the actions of the tunnellers. the subterranean soldiers whose job it was to dig under enemy lines, to lay explosives and then set them off. What a death it must have been, and how horrific that death must have seemed to Paul Nash, who as a little boy had this recurrent nightmare of being smothered. Well, here was a death where at the instant of your annihilation you were smothered, you were buried. Imagine the landscape, that which to Nash was always the great symbol of security, the unchanging aspect of the world. Suddenly the landscape turned into a creature, a shape-shifting monster that might at any moment swallow you up. There's something very understated about his images. They look almost like the work of a map maker, a topographer. Well, in a sense, they are topography, but they are the topography of an atrocious war.
Nash has sometimes been criticised for leaving out the actual victims of war. But to appreciate his reticence, you have to understand what this war did to the human body, and above all, to the human face. Nash's old tutor at the Slade, Henry Tonks, who'd trained as a surgeon, made drawings of some of the worst injuries. They're still preserved at the Royal College of Surgeons in London.
What's the origin of these truly extraordinary pastel drawings of men with facial injuries?
These were created by Henry Tonks in his practice at Aldershot and then later at Sidcup, where the Queen Mary Hospital became a centre for specialist treatment for soldiers with facial injuries. You have an individual such as this man here, you can see quite clearly the before and the after of the process, but in between there would have been maybe 2 or 3 operations, so it's not just going from injury to being
Finished.
completely repaired.
I think they're remarkable because of the way in which they show us, we who are so far now from the horror of that war, just how appalling those injuries were. Almost like images from nightmare. One thought does occur to me, that I'm on the trail of Paul Nash, and of course the one thing that I can never see, because he didn't paint any self-portraits when he was in the front, I can't see Paul Nash at the front. I can't see him, I can't picture him in my mind. But I'm looking at these and I've suddenly got this very uncanny sense that these are his eyes. These are his eyes. He writes with such anger and such outrage and such bewilderment. And suddenly looking at these eyes, I think, yes, these are the eyes that saw. This is what Paul Nash felt like.
Even when they're not looking at you directly, you've still got that gaze is coming out of the pastels at you.
Yeah, it gives me a shiver.
You can still feel Paul Nash's anger, the rage of a betrayed generation, in this, the most apocalyptic of his battlescapes, to which he gave the ironic title, "We Are Making a New World." Nash wrote to his wife Margaret while he was painting it to say, "I am no longer an artist. I am a messenger who will bring back word from the men who are fighting to those who want the war to go on forever. It will have a bitter truth, and may it burn their lousy souls." It's a painting that gives the lie to the idea that Nash left out the dead bodies of war and painted only its landscapes, because this landscape is a body. It's churned earth like burned flesh, cratered and bubbled and horribly melted. Its tree stumps like mutilated limbs. The red clouds in the sky like scarred and angry flesh. Duty and decorum and the dignity of the wounded meant that he couldn't actually paint the victims of war, but he found a way to paint their pain and suffering nonetheless. And its truth does still burn, as brightly and defiantly as that cyclops-eyed sun. After the war, Paul and Margaret Nash moved to Dymchurch on the coast of Kent. An intriguing choice, one of the closest places in all of England to the killing fields of Flanders. Nash would spend 4 difficult years here. Money was tight, but there was little he could do about it. He was suffering a breakdown. During the war, he'd painted landscapes to evoke the bodies of the dead. Now, when he was able to work, he painted landscapes of the mind of an uneasy survivor. The seawall stands ready for the onset of the tide. The tide comes in, drowning the world. Or is this an image of Paul Nash's mind, drowning in unhappy feelings? There's no doubt Nash felt terribly alone during his time at Dymchurch. But gradually he came to realise that he wasn't the only painter struggling with a sense of personal trauma during these dislocated times. In Europe, a new movement of artists was developing a new language of art. The language of dream and nightmare. To express the sense that reality was out of joint. They called themselves surrealists and their work surrealism. When Nash found out about surrealism, it gave him a new sense of hope that he wasn't on his own. He was drawn to the pre-war cityscapes of Italian painter Giorgio de Chirico, who never signed up with the surrealists, but was admired by them as a pioneer of the ominous and the uncanny. During the later 1920s, Nash introduced unexpected, dreamlike elements into his own pictures. Inexplicable objects. Mystery buildings. These deliberately unsettling jigsaw compositions marked a bold change of direction. Nash wasn't attempting to capture a slice of the world, but a frame of mind. And he developed the approach further during the following decade, becoming England's preeminent painter of the Enigma.
Paul Nash's paintings of the 1930s are very mysterious. Even the title of this one, Opening, is ambiguous. Does it refer to a physical opening, a noun, or could it be the verb opening? Is it a depiction of the process of opening up? If Nash is a surrealist, he's a very English kind of surrealist, very reserved. His paintings are low-toned. They don't reach out and grab you. You have to reach into them to try and clutch at their meanings. I think in the case of this painting, I feel that it's Nash's way of painting his own state of mind at a kind of threshold moment in his own life. Its subject, after all, is a threshold. 2 years before the picture was painted, his father had died. A great break in his life. They'd been very close. His father had encouraged him in his desire to be an artist against the rather conservative disapproval of the rest of the family. So his father's gone, and on top of that, he sold the family house, Ivor Heath, which he loved, in Buckinghamshire. And this detail here, the exposed brickwork, seems to me to suggest the idea of a house that's been left or perhaps abandoned. The opening perhaps suggests Nash's sense that he has to enter, to embark on a new kind of life from now on. But there are also elements in the painting which suggest that, as far as he's concerned, that opening to a new life is not going to be easily found. There's a barrier right down the middle of this dream doorway. There's another barrier at the bottom. And while the sea behind seems bright blue, calm, very much a Mediterranean sea, not the Channel, while that seems to illustrate some idea in Nash's mind that he might find some form of tranquility, he might find some form of beauty and fulfillment in his life, he knows that it's not going to be easy. At the heart of the painting falls the shadow.